Did you know that the end of the world was once scheduled for a Tuesday in October? There were no alerts on your phone, no breaking news banners scrolling across your television, mostly because you didn't have a phone that could leave your house, and your television was a giant piece of furniture that showed 3 channels in black and white. It was a simpler time, a time when the greatest threat to your day seemed to be a traffic jam or running out of coffee. The planet was spinning along just fine, blissfully unaware that it was about to hold its breath for 13 straight days. Before you get too comfortable, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel to encourage me to make more content like this. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and let's begin tonight's journey. The year is 1962, and the air is crisp with the promise of autumn. You can almost feel it. The cool breeze through an open car window, the scent of burning leaves mingling with the exhaust fumes of leaded gasoline. The world feels big and full of potential. The cars are works of art, chrome and steel sculpted into optimistic shapes, even if their safety features were mostly wishful thinking. You are living in a time of incredible contrast. On one hand, there is a vibrant, youthful energy embodied by the young president in the White House, a feeling that a new generation is in charge, a feeling often referred to as Camelot. The economy is humming, the suburbs are expanding, and the future seems like a brightly lit highway stretching to the horizon. The music on the radio is catchy and simple, songs about teenage love and dancing, tunes that seem a universe away from nuclear annihilation. Yet, a shadow lingers at the edges of this bright picture. You see it in the little things. Your children practice duck and cover drills at school, learning to hide under their flimsy wooden desks as if that could offer any protection from an atomic blast. It's a strange, almost surreal piece of the national routine. Some of your neighbors have even built fallout shelters in their backyards, stocking them with canned goods and board games, a peculiar hobby born from a deep, unspoken fear. Historians still debate whether the cheerful facade of 1962 was a genuine reflection of public mood, or a deliberate coping mechanism against the simmering anxiety of the Cold War. It was a world where you could be planning a family barbecue and subconsciously calculating your home's distance from the nearest military base. Now, drift thousands of miles south, over the sparkling turquoise waters of the Caribbean. Let your mind settle on the island of Cuba, a place of lush green jungles, sweet tobacco fields, and vibrant music. To most Americans, Cuba is that place you hear about on the news, a political headache 90 miles off the coast of Florida. But something is happening there, hidden beneath the canopy of royal palms and shielded from the prying eyes of the world. In quiet, isolated clearings, teams of men are working with a grim, silent efficiency. They speak a language that is not Spanish. They are assembling strange, colossal structures. Long metal cylinders aimed at the sky, concrete bunkers, and intricate webs of wires and launch pads. They work under the humid sun by day and under floodlights by night, a secret city of destruction rising from the fertile soil. Each turn of a wrench, each drop of poured concrete, is a tick of a clock that you don't even know is counting down. You are blissfully unaware. You are finishing your dinner, perhaps watching the Beverly Hillbillies on television, while the architecture of Armageddon is being meticulously, quietly, and deliberately assembled just over the horizon. The storm is gathering, and the world is asleep. Now, let your perspective shift from the quiet suburban home to the very center of American power, the Oval Office. The air here is different, thick with the scent of old wood, leather, and the faint lingering aroma of President Kennedy's cigar smoke. You are standing in a room where the fate of millions can be decided with the stroke of a pen. But right now, the most powerful man in the world is a prisoner of his own past. A ghost haunts this office, a ghost born just a year and a half earlier on the swampy shores of Cuba's Bay of Pigs. You can almost feel its chilling presence, a constant reminder of failure, a whisper of doubt in every decision. In April of 1961, Kennedy had inherited a CIA plan, codenamed Operation Zapata, to train and equip a brigade of Cuban exiles to invade their homeland and overthrow Fidel Castro. It was presented to him by confident, decorated men as a sure thing, a neat and tidy solution. The plan was a disaster from the very start. It was the geopolitical equivalent of trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The invasion force was pinned down on the beach, their supply ships were sunk, and the promised popular uprising against Castro never materialized. It was a complete and utter humiliation on the world stage, a black eye for the young president who had promised a new era of American strength and competence. For 3 agonizing days, Kennedy had to watch as the men he had sent to their fate were captured or killed, utterly powerless to help them. That failure became a scar on his presidency, and more importantly, on his psyche. You can imagine him at night, sitting in this very office, replaying every flawed assumption, every piece of bad advice he had accepted. He learned a brutal lesson, one that would fundamentally change how he viewed the men around him. He learned that generals and intelligence chiefs could be spectacularly wrong. This ghost of failure is now his most important, if unwelcome, advisor. It's why he is cautious, why he questions everything. When his advisors now spread maps across the Resolute desk, their confidence is no longer infectious. It is suspect. He looks at their faces and remembers the same certainty they projected before the Bay of Pigs. One of the more peculiar details of that failed invasion was the CIA's baffling choice to rely on a single, easily targeted airfield for the exiles' air support. A flaw so obvious it seems almost comical in retrospect. This kind of oversight, this assumption that the enemy would be foolish and weak, was a mistake he swore he would never make again. He was now a student of doubt, a leader who understood that the gap between a plan and reality could be a graveyard. Historians still debate the precise impact of the Bay of Pigs on Kennedy's handling of the coming crisis. Some argue it created a Bay of Pigs syndrome, making him so wary of his military advisors that he was predisposed to reject their aggressive recommendations. Others suggest the opposite, that the humiliation made him determined to never appear weak or indecisive again, steeling his resolve to stand firm against the Soviets, no matter the cost. Perhaps both are true. He was a man caught between the fear of repeating a past mistake and the fear of making a new, infinitely more catastrophic one. As those secret structures rise in the Cuban jungle, the man who will have to confront them is not the same confident leader from his inauguration. He is warier, more skeptical, and deeply, personally acquainted with the bitter taste of defeat. The ghost is watching, waiting to see if he has learned its lesson. Now, leave the polished floors of the White House behind. Travel across the vast, grey expanse of the Atlantic Ocean until you find yourself on the deck of a nondescript Soviet freighter. The ship is a steel oven, groaning as it cuts through the warm waters of the Sargasso Sea. You are a young man, barely out of your teens, drafted from a town so far inland that you had never seen the ocean before this voyage. They told you that you were going to the Arctic to help build a new strategic outpost on the Chukotka Peninsula, a place of ice and polar bears. That was the official story, the grand deception known as Operation Anadir. It was a lie of monumental scale, involving over 80 ships, thousands of soldiers, and a payload that could rewrite the future of humanity. The journey has been a miserable one. You are packed into cramped, sweltering quarters with dozens of other men. For weeks, you have not been allowed on the main deck, forced to stay below to avoid being spotted by American patrol planes. The air is a thick soup of diesel fumes, sweat, and cheap tobacco. Yet, in your footlocker, packed under your bunk, is a heavy sheepskin coat, felt-lined boots, and even a pair of skis. Skis, for a journey that is taking you directly into the sweltering heart of the tropics. You have spent nights sweating in your bunk, imagining the absurdity of skiing through a jungle. This elaborate charade was meant to fool not only the West, but the majority of the soldiers involved, including you. The secrecy was absolute. a suffocating blanket of paranoia. Below you, in the ship's hold, lies the reason for all this deception. You've only caught glimpses of it during the nighttime loading operations back in the port of Sevastopol. Long, canvas-wrapped cylinders, handled with a nervous reverence by special officers you've never seen before. Crates stenciled with cryptic codes, guarded day and night by men with stern faces and automatic weapons. You and your comrades whisper about what it could be. Advanced radar equipment, perhaps new anti-aircraft guns. But there is a weight to this cargo, a feeling that goes beyond mere military hardware. It feels precious and terrible at the same time. The officers never speak of it, and you know better than to ask. Your job is to be invisible, to endure the heat and the seasickness, and to guard a secret you don't fully understand. Historians continue to debate whether Khrushchev's primary motive was to protect his new Cuban ally from another American invasion, or if it was a bold, offensive move to counter the American Jupiter missiles placed in Turkey, right on his own doorstep. But for you, on this rusting ship, geopolitics is an abstraction. Your reality is the endless rocking, the dwindling water rations, and the gnawing uncertainty. As you finally approach land, you see the impossible silhouette of palm trees against a setting sun. This is not the Arctic. This is not a land of ice and snow. You can smell the sweet, heavy scent of tropical flowers and damp earth on the breeze. You have arrived in Cuba. The lie is over, and a far more dangerous truth is about to be unpacked from the belly of your ship. The world has no idea you are here, but it will soon, very soon. Your viewpoint now soars, leaving the humid Cuban soil far below. You are ascending into the cold, thin, silent air at the very edge of space. You are strapped into the cockpit of a U-2 spy plane, a delicate, single-engine glider with an enormous wingspan, nicknamed the Dragon Lady by its pilots. At 70,000 feet, the sky above you is no longer blue, but a deep, bruised purple-black. You can clearly see the gentle curvature of the earth, a serene and beautiful sight that feels profoundly disconnected from the tense political world below. Your mission is to be a ghost, an invisible eye in the sky. You fly a pre-planned route over western Cuba, a long straight line across a grid of sugarcane fields and rolling green hills. You are not looking for anything with your own eyes. Your job is to fly the plane perfectly, to be the steady hand for the incredibly sophisticated camera system nestled in the belly of your aircraft. Down there, the work of the men from the Soviet freighter is continuing. They are working under the assumption that they are safe, that the vastness of the sky will protect their secret. They have no idea that miles above them, a camera lens is methodically capturing their every move. The camera system is a marvel of its time, capable of resolving an object the size of a baseball from over 13 miles away. It clicks and whirs with a quiet, automated precision, capturing thousands of high-resolution images on a massive roll of film. Each photograph is a frozen moment, a piece of a puzzle that no one on the ground has yet assembled. Your flight path is dangerous, well within range of newly installed Soviet surface-to-air missiles. But for now, the sky is quiet. You are just a fleeting shadow passing over a sun-drenched island. Hours later, you are back on solid ground at a secure airbase. The most important part of your mission begins now. The canister of film, your precious cargo, is carefully unloaded and rushed onto a dedicated courier jet bound for Washington, D.C. It arrives at the National Photographic Interpretation Center, a sterile, windowless building filled with experts whose entire world is the color gray. Here, under the stark glow of light tables, your journey's purpose is revealed. Photo interpreters, men and women trained to find needles in global haystacks, unspool the miles of film. They use stereoscopes and magnifying glasses, their eyes tracing every line and shadow. They are looking for anomalies, for anything out of place. It is painstaking, meticulous work. Then, one of them stops. He leans closer to the light table, his breath fogging the film. He calls over a supervisor. In a series of images from the San Cristobal area, he has found something. A pattern in the jungle clearing that looks unnatural. There are tents, vehicle tracks, and long canvas-covered objects lying on trailers. He cross-references the shapes with the intelligence community's catalogue of Soviet military hardware. The room grows quiet. The shape is unmistakable. It is a launch erector for an SS for medium-range ballistic missile. Then they find more. Fuel trailers, guidance bunkers, the entire signature of a Soviet nuclear missile site being assembled right here in America's backyard. Historians still debate whether the CIA had missed earlier, more subtle clues from human intelligence on the ground, but there is no debating the ice-cold certainty of these photographs. The secret is out. The abstract warnings from intelligence briefings have suddenly become a series of stark, black and white images. That evening, the photographs are mounted on briefing boards and delivered to National Security Advisor McGorge Bundy. The following morning, on October 16th, they are placed on the president's desk. The calm is over. The storm has arrived. You are now in the cabinet room of the White House. The morning light streams through the tall windows, but it does little to warm the chilling atmosphere in the room. The air is thick with a tension so profound you can almost taste it, like the metallic temps of static before a lightning strike. Before you, seated around a long, polished mahogany table, are a dozen of the most powerful men in the country. This is not a scheduled meeting. This is a summons. They have been pulled from their routines. Their faces a mixture of confusion, concern, and dawning horror. This is the first meeting of the group that will become known to history as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, a secret circle of 12, hand-picked by the President for their minds, their experience, and their loyalty. In the center of the table, like evidence at a crime scene, lie the photographs from the U-2 flight. You watch as President Kennedy, his face grim and pale, gestures towards them. The men lean forward, their initial reactions a silent wave of shock rippling through the room. There is Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, a man who sees the world in numbers and probabilities, his quick mind already calculating trajectories and kill ratios. There is Secretary of State Dean Rusk, a cautious diplomat, his expression one of deep foreboding, and next to the President sits his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, his gaze intense, acting not just as a cabinet member, but as the President's ultimate confidant. The uniformed military chiefs are there too, their faces hard as granite, seeing not a diplomatic problem, but a clear and present military target. The psychological pressure in this room is immense. These are men accustomed to crisis, but this is different. This is existential. The initial disbelief quickly gives way to a surge of raw collective anger. How dare they? How could the Soviets do this? So brazenly, so secretly, 90 miles from their shores. You can hear it in the clipped, sharp tones of their voices as the first suggestions are thrown out. They talk of surgical airstrikes, of a full-scale invasion. The military men argue that anything less than a swift, overwhelming show of force would be perceived as weakness, an invitation for further aggression. The ghost of the Bay of Pigs is in the room with you again, urging them toward action, toward reversing that past humiliation with a display of undeniable power. But something else is happening, something no one in the room is aware of except the President himself. If you listen closely, beneath the urgent, hushed conversations, you might hear a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It is the quiet whir of a hidden, reel-to-reel tape recorder. Kennedy has secretly begun to record these meetings, a decision that would provide historians with an unprecedented, unfiltered look into the anatomy of a crisis. This small, obscure detail changes everything. You are not just imagining this scene, you are, in a sense, listening to it as it happened. Historians still debate whether the initial shock unified the men, or if the deep fractures between the hawks and the doves, the warriors and the diplomats, appeared in those very first moments. The tapes suggest the latter. The battle for the president's mind began immediately. The men in this room have just been told that the world as they know it could end within a week. Their task is to find a way to prevent it, and they have absolutely no idea how. The secret tapes continue to spin, capturing every word, every cough, every frustrated sigh in the cabinet room. The initial, chaotic storm of anger has passed, and now the grim work begins. The question hanging in the air is no longer how could this happen, but a far more terrifying one. What do we do now? The debate crystallizes around two starkly different paths, two fundamentally opposing philosophies on how to deal with an enemy who has placed a gun to your head. It is a choice between a sudden, violent strike or a slow, suffocating squeeze. To strike or to strangle. You are a silent observer to this momentous argument, a fly on the wall as the fate of the world is weighed in the balance. On one side are the hawks, led by the military brass. You can see the certainty in their eyes, the crisp confidence in their posture. They see the missile sites not as a political problem, but as an enemy fortification. Their solution is simple, direct, and brutal. A massive, coordinated airstrike to wipe the missile sites off the map, followed by a full-scale invasion of Cuba to remove Castro once and for all. General Curtis LeMay, the cigar-chomping Air Force Chief of Staff, makes his case with blunt force. He sees anything less than immediate military action as appeasement, a dangerous show of weakness that will only embolden the Soviets. To him, the blockade is a slow, weak response, like trying to cure cancer with a band-aid. His argument is that America has overwhelming nuclear superiority, and they should use that leverage now, before the missiles become fully operational. The risk of a Soviet response, he argues, is minimal. On the other side are the Doves, a more cautious and varied group. They are led intellectually by Robert McNamara, who, despite being Secretary of Defense, begins to meticulously poke holes in the military's confident plans. He asks the questions the generals don't want to hear. What if the airstrikes aren't perfect? What if they miss just one missile? What happens if a Soviet soldier is killed, forcing Khrushchev's hand? Robert Kennedy becomes the moral and emotional core of this argument. He reminds the room that an unannounced, surprise attack would make his brother, the president, no better than Tojo at Pearl Harbor. He speaks of the unpredictable nature of escalation, how one act of violence begets another, leading to a chain reaction that no one can control. The world, he argues, could spiral into nuclear war not because anyone wants it, but because they are trapped on a path of automatic responses. This is more than a strategic disagreement. It is a deep psychological conflict. The strike option is born of anger and a desire for control, a hot-blooded impulse to eliminate the threat immediately. The alternative, which begins to take shape, is born of caution and a desire to manage the crisis, a cold-blooded calculation to slow things down. The term blockade is floated, but it's quickly dismissed. A blockade, under international law, is an act of war. A young legal advisor suggests a different word, a word that sounds less aggressive, more clinical, more defensive: quarantine. It's a brilliant linguistic move. You don't blockade a country, you quarantine it to prevent the arrival of offensive weapons. It frames the action not as an attack, but as a preventative measure. It is a show of strength that leaves the door open for diplomacy. It draws a line in the ocean and puts the very next move squarely on Khrushchev's shoulders. Historians still debate whether Kennedy was truly undecided during these early debates, or if he was already leaning towards the quarantine and was simply allowing the hawks to fully voice their arguments to ensure their eventual support. For now, he just listens, his face an unreadable mask, as the two terrible options are laid before him. For days, the world has continued to spin on its axis, completely oblivious to the secret. Frantic debates happening inside the White House. But a secret of this magnitude cannot be kept forever. You are sitting in your living room on the evening of Monday, October 22nd. The day has been normal, routine. Perhaps you are helping your children with their homework, or reading the newspaper, or simply relaxing in front of the television. The warm, electronic glow of the cathode ray tube fills the room with a sense of cozy normalcy. Suddenly, the regularly scheduled program is interrupted. A serious-looking news anchor appears, announcing that the President of the United States will be addressing the nation on a matter of the highest national urgency. An announcement like this is rare, and it immediately silences the room. A nervous energy begins to build. To maintain the secrecy before this moment, the White House had to engage in a bit of theater. When reporters noticed the president canceling his campaign trips, his press secretary, Pierre Salinger, had to tell the press pool the president was suffering from a cold, a mundane and relatable excuse to hide a terrifying truth. Now, the pretense is over. The presidential seal appears on the screen, a stark and imposing image. Then, the camera cuts to the Oval Office. You see President Kennedy sitting at his desk. He looks young, as he always does, but tonight there is a visible strain on his face, a deep seriousness in his eyes that you have never seen before. The room is silent as he begins to speak. His voice is calm, steady, and devoid of panic, but the words he uses are like hammer blows. He speaks of unmistakable evidence and a series of offensive missile sites being prepared on the island of Cuba. He explains that these are not defensive weapons, but medium-range ballistic missiles capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, or Mexico City. He calls the Soviet action a clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace. In that moment, the abstract fear of the Cold War, the fear of duck and cover drills and backyard fallout shelters, becomes terrifyingly real and specific. The threat is no longer a distant possibility in a far-off land. It is 90 miles away, and it is armed with nuclear warheads. Then he lays out his response, drawing a clear and unmistakable line in the sand, or rather, in the water. He announces a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba. He explains that a naval ring will be established around the island, and any ship found to be carrying prohibited cargo will be turned back. The message to Nikita Khrushchev is delivered not through a secret diplomatic cable, but on live television for the entire world to hear. Turn your ships around, dismantle the missiles. The alternative is left unspoken, but it hangs in the air, heavy and suffocating. Historians still debate whether this public address was truly for the American people, or if it was a direct high-stakes message aimed squarely at the Kremlin, a way of bypassing the often slow and deceitful channels of traditional diplomacy. As the president's speech ends, the familiar programming does not return. There are only newscasters with grim faces, trying to explain the inexplicable. The world you knew just 15 minutes ago is gone. A new, much more dangerous one has just been born. The world has shrunk to the size of this steel deck. You are standing on the bridge of the USS Essex, a massive aircraft carrier serving as the flagship of the quarantine fleet. The salt spray mists your face, and the deck beneath your feet hums with the steady, powerful vibration of the ship's engines. All around you, stretching to the grey horizon, is the rest of the American fleet. 180 warships, a steel ring of quarantine, have formed a 500 nautical mile arc around Cuba. The date is Wednesday, October 24th. The quarantine is officially in effect. The president has drawn his line in the water, and now you, and the thousands of other young sailors around you, are the ones who have to hold it. The tension is a physical presence. Every sailor is a tightly wound spring. Men go about their duties with a quiet, focused efficiency, their usual jokes and banter replaced by clipped, professional exchanges. You watch men scanning the horizon with binoculars, their eyes straining for the first sign of a smudge of smoke, the first silhouette of a Soviet ship. On the radar screen in the Combat Information Center, the glowing green sweep is like the hand of a doomsday clock. For now, the screen shows only friendly blips and the vast, empty expanse of the sea. It is a silent, global staring contest, and you are on the front line. The waiting is the hardest part. The silence is the loudest thing you've ever heard. The rules of engagement have been drilled into everyone. They are a strange, carefully calibrated dance of escalation. If a Soviet ship refuses a request to stop, you are not to immediately open fire. The first step is to fire a star shell, a bright, harmless firework, to get their attention. If they still don't stop, you are to fire a warning shot across their bow, a solid projectile that makes a very loud splash and an even louder political statement. The most peculiar and obscure part of the plan, a detail that feels almost absurd in its delicacy, involves the submarines. If a Soviet submarine is detected, the destroyers are ordered to drop small, practice-sized depth charges near it. These are not powerful enough to damage the sub, but their concussion would be a loud, unmistakable, underwater knock on the door, a signal to surface or be treated as hostile. It's the military equivalent of a very aggressive "pretty please." Then it happens. A report crackles over the radio. Radar has picked them up. 2 Soviet freighters, the Gagarin and the Komiles, are approaching the line. With them is a Soviet submarine. The entire fleet tenses. This is the moment. The abstract crisis of photographs and speeches has become a set of very real ships moving at 15 knots. On the bridge, you can feel the shift. Orders are given in low, steady voices. Destroyers move to intercept. The entire world, whether it knows it or not, is holding its breath with you. You watch through powerful binoculars as the tiny shapes on the horizon grow larger. Will they challenge the line? Will you hear the order to fire that first warning shot? Historians still debate whether the quarantine was a masterful act of coercive diplomacy that gave both sides time to think, or if it was a dangerous game of chicken played with nuclear-armed ships. At this moment, it feels very much like the latter. The Soviet ships get closer and closer, and then, inexplicably, they stop, dead in the water, just short of the line. A collective, unspoken sigh of relief seems to ripple through the fleet. The first test has been passed. The Soviets have not challenged the quarantine, but the submarine is still down there, and dozens more ships are still on their way. The crisis is not over. It has just begun. The deck of the American warship dissolves, and you find yourself transported across half the world to the cold, imposing heart of the Soviet Empire. You are inside the Kremlin, a fortress of red brick and golden domes that has been the center of Russian power for centuries. The halls are opulent, cavernous spaces where the sound of your footsteps echoes against marble floors and gilded ceilings. But the grandeur is a thin veneer over a palpable sense of anxiety. Here, the news of Kennedy's speech and the naval quarantine was not a public shock, but a private, strategic catastrophe. You are now inside the mind of the man who started it all, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. He is not the simple, boorish peasant caricature often portrayed in the West. He is a complex, contradictory man. He is a true believer in the communist cause, a shrewd political survivor who clawed his way to the top after Stalin's death, and a gambler with a flair for the dramatic. You can almost see him, a short, stout man with a bald head and a surprisingly expressive face, pacing his office. He is prone to explosive fits of temper, but also to moments of surprising charm and emotional vulnerability. He is the same man who, just 2 years earlier, had famously banged his shoe on a desk at the United Nations in a fit of pique, a bizarre and unforgettable act of political theater. Now, that same impulsive, emotional man holds the fate of the world in his hands. When the news of Kennedy's speech reached him, his first reaction was volcanic fury. It was a personal insult, a public humiliation. He had intended for the missiles to be a secret until they were fully operational. A stunning surprise that would fundamentally shift the global balance of power. He saw it as a way to level the playing field, to counter the American Jupiter missiles in Turkey that could strike Moscow in minutes. In his mind, he was only doing what the Americans had already done to him. Historians still debate whether his primary motivation was truly defensive, a way to protect Castro's Cuba from another American invasion, or if it was a brazenly offensive move to gain strategic leverage. But Kennedy's public reveal had turned his secret gambit into a global showdown. He was cornered. His public response was pure bluster and defiance. Soviet newspapers, like Pravda and Izvestia, denounced the American quarantine as an act of unprecedented aggressive action and outright piracy. Soviet ambassadors at the UN railed against American imperialism. Khrushchev sent a defiant letter to Kennedy, accusing him of pushing mankind toward the abyss of a world nuclear missile war. It was a performance, a necessary show of strength for the hardliners within his own government, the men in the Presidium who were watching his every move, ready to pounce on any sign of weakness. He couldn't afford to look like he was backing down, but privately, the weight of his decision was immense. Unlike some of his more militant advisors, Khrushchev had seen the true face of war. He had served as a political commissar during the Battle of Stalingrad, and he understood the human cost of conflict in a way that many generals did not. He also knew, perhaps more intimately than Kennedy, the terrifying power of the weapons at his command. His own son, Sergei, was a rocket engineer. He didn't just see the missiles as abstract symbols of power. He understood their mechanics, their flight times, and their horrifying destructive capability. So while he projected an image of iron resolve to the world, he also gave a quiet, crucial order. The Soviet ships carrying military cargo, the ones approaching the quarantine line, were ordered to stop. It was the first small, almost imperceptible sign that behind the blustering facade, the gambler was beginning to calculate the odds and question if this was a bet he could truly win. Leave the cold stone of the Kremlin and let your mind travel back across the ocean to the humid, tense streets of Washington, D.C., while the leaders of the world are shouting at each other across a public stage. Another conversation is beginning. It is a conversation held in whispers, in quiet rooms, far from the glare of television cameras. This is the world of the backchannel, the unofficial, unspoken, and absolutely vital lifeline of diplomacy. You are now a silent witness to this secret dialogue, the only real hope for a peaceful resolution. Your focus settles on a grand, imposing building on 16th Street, the Soviet embassy. Inside, you meet a man named Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador to the United States. He is not a stereotypical, stone-faced apparatchik. He is a sophisticated, intelligent, and pragmatic diplomat who understands America far better than most of his superiors in Moscow. He has a professional, almost friendly relationship with the Kennedy administration, particularly with the president's brother, Robert. They have spoken many times before, building a fragile foundation of trust. That trust is about to be tested like never before. Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, becomes the president's personal envoy, the human embodiment of his brother's resolve and his fear. You are with them now, in a quiet office. The meeting is tense, but it is a conversation, not a confrontation. Robert Kennedy speaks with a raw, emotional honesty that cuts through the usual diplomatic language. He tells Dobrynin that his brother is not bluffing. He explains the immense pressure the president is under from his military advisors to launch an attack. He paints a vivid, terrifying picture of what will happen if the Soviet ships try to run the quarantine. It is a message of both threat and desperation. He is trying to make Dobrynin, and by extension Khrushchev, understand that this is not a game. Dobrynin listens intently, his face a mask of professional calm, absorbing every word, trying to separate the genuine warning from the strategic posturing. This meeting between Kennedy and Dobrynin is the most famous backchannel, but it is not the only one. In a fascinating and almost bizarre side story, another channel opens up through a journalist. An ABC News correspondent named John Scully is having lunch at the Occidental Grill when he is approached by a man he knows as a Soviet embassy official named Alexander Fomin. Fomin is actually a high-ranking KGB officer. He pulls Scully aside and proposes, Hypothetically, a deal. What if the Soviets removed the missiles under UN supervision in exchange for a public American promise not to invade Cuba? Scully, realizing he has just become a pawn in a global chess match, rushes this proposal straight to the White House. Historians still debate whether this was a genuine, authorized offer from Khrushchev, or if it was a rogue feeler put out by the local KGB station, a desperate attempt to find a way out. Regardless of their origins, these back channels are a critical release valve for the building pressure. They allow the two sides to speak to each other as human beings, to convey nuance, fear, and a shared desire to avoid catastrophe that is impossible to express in public speeches and formal ultimatums. While the navies of the world's two greatest superpowers are facing off in the Caribbean, the real work of saving the world is being done in quiet conversations, over cups of tea, in embassy backrooms, and on park benches. It is a fragile, whispered connection in a world that is screaming for war. The days have blurred into a single, continuous moment of unbearable tension. You are in the White House, but it no longer feels like the seat of government. It feels like a submarine, deep underwater, listening for the ping of an enemy destroyer. The men of XCOM are running on fumes, fueled by coffee and annoying dread. The quarantine is holding a fragile line of steel on the water, but it is a passive measure. On the island of Cuba, the Soviets are working frantically, bringing the missile sites closer and closer to full operational status with each passing hour. The world is in a state of suspended animation, trapped between a failed policy of containment and the unthinkable alternative of war. Hope is a currency in dangerously short supply. Then, on the evening of Friday, October 26th, something new arrives. It does not come in a sealed diplomatic pouch delivered by a stern-faced courier. It begins to clatter, letter by letter, over the teletype machine connecting the State Department to the American Embassy in Moscow. A message is coming through from Khrushchev, a very, very long message. As the pages begin to pile up, it becomes immediately clear that this is not a typical diplomatic communication. It is rambling, emotional, and deeply personal. You can almost imagine the translators, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights, working frantically to keep up, struggling not just with the Russian words, but with the raw, chaotic emotion behind them. This letter is a psychological portrait of a man under immense strain. It is a raw hue and cry from the heart of the Kremlin. Khrushchev abandons the sterile language of geopolitics and speaks directly, as one man to another, about their shared responsibility. He uses a powerful, unforgettable metaphor. He says that Kennedy and he should not now pull on the ends of the rope in which they have tied the knot of war, because the more the two of them pull, the tighter that knot will be tied. He speaks of the horrors of war, of the millions who would die, of the ashes that would be left behind. It is the voice of a man who is not just a premier or a communist, but a grandfather, a human being staring into the abyss and recoiling in horror. Buried within this long, stream of consciousness plea is the kernel of a deal, the first real off-ramp from the highway to annihilation. It is the same proposal that was whispered through the back channel by the KGB agent to the journalist. If the United States will give its assurance that it will not invade Cuba, he will remove the missiles. The offer is laid bare. When the final translation is rushed to the White House, it lands like a bombshell of a different kind, a bombshell of hope. For the first time in days, the suffocating pressure in the room seems to lift, if only slightly, but it also creates confusion. Some of the more hawkish members are deeply suspicious. Is this a trick? Is Khrushchev just trying to buy more time for his crews to ready the missiles? Is he drunk, or has he had a complete nervous breakdown? Historians still debate whether this letter was a calculated piece of theatrical diplomacy designed to appear emotional, or a genuine, spontaneous outpouring from a leader cracking under the strain. But for Robert Kennedy, and for the president himself, the letter's emotional core feels authentic. It is a sign that the man on the other side is just as scared as they are. A fragile, unexpected connection has been made. A path out of the darkness, however narrow and treacherous, has finally appeared. The fragile hope that bloomed in the White House overnight is a delicate, precious thing. You can almost feel the collective exhale of the men in XCOM as they gather on the morning of Saturday, October 27th. The emotional, rambling letter from Khrushchev is on the table, a tangible sign that there is a human being on the other end of this crisis, a man who is just as afraid of the abyss as they are. A plan is beginning to form, a careful, diplomatic response that accepts the offer, a promise of non-invasion in exchange for the removal of the missiles. For the first time in what feels like an eternity, there is a glimmer of a peaceful resolution. The knot of war, as Khrushchev so eloquently put it, might just be loosened. Then, the teletype machine clatters to life again, but the message it brings is not another secret plea. It is a news bulletin. The hope is shattered as quickly as it appeared. A new message from Khrushchev has not been sent privately. It has been broadcast publicly, for the entire world to hear, over Radio Moscow. The tone of this message is completely different. Gone is the emotional, rambling grandfather. In his place is the cold, calculating premier of the Soviet Union. The voice is formal, official, and much, much harder. It is the whiplash of this change that sends a jolt of ice water through the White House. The new demand is a public quid pro quo. Khrushchev announces that he will remove the missiles from Cuba only if President Kennedy agrees to remove the American Jupiter missiles from Turkey. On the surface, it seems like a reasonable, symmetrical trade, a missile for a missile. But for Kennedy, it is a political impossibility. The Jupiter missiles, while technically obsolete and of little strategic value, were a potent symbol of America's commitment to NATO. They were a promise to a key ally. To publicly trade them away under Soviet threat would be seen as a craven act of appeasement. It would look like he was sacrificing an ally's security to save his own skin. The NATO alliance, the very bedrock of Western defense, could fracture and collapse. The mood in the cabinet room plummets. The hawks, who were suspicious of the first letter, now feel utterly vindicated. You can hear the "I told you so" in their grim, angry voices. They argued that this proves Khrushchev was never negotiating in good faith, that he was simply using the first letter to buy time while he raised the stakes. The calls for an immediate military strike, which had quieted overnight, now return with a vengeance. The president is trapped. He cannot accept the public deal, and he cannot reject it without appearing to be the one who is unwilling to compromise, potentially pushing Khrushchev toward war. It feels like a checkmate. The two letters are so different in tone and substance that they seem to have been written by two entirely different men. Historians still debate whether this second, harder-line message was the result of Khrushchev being overruled by the Politburo, or if it was a calculated move all along, a classic good cop, bad cop tactic. Was the first letter a genuine plea, and the second the result of pressure from his own military? Or was it all a brilliant, cynical performance? The men of XCOM don't know, and they don't have time to find out. As they argue and despair, a quiet, almost absurdly creative idea begins to form. It is a stroke of lateral thinking, born of sheer desperation. What if they simply pretend the second letter never arrived? What if they choose to respond only to the first, emotional, hopeful letter? It is a bizarre diplomatic maneuver, a decision to ignore an official, public broadcast and answer a private, rambling teletype. It is a gamble on the hope that the first Khrushchev, the frightened grandfather, is the one who is truly in charge. The date is Saturday, October 27th. History will remember it as Black Saturday. You are back in the cabinet room, and the air is stale with exhaustion and recycled arguments. The debate over the two letters, the emotional plea and the hardline demand, is still raging. Time is no longer an ally, it is the enemy. With every passing minute, the missiles in Cuba become more operational, and the window for a diplomatic solution closes a little more. The world is a tightly coiled spring, and today it will be stretched to its absolute breaking point. The first jolt comes not from the warm waters of the Caribbean, but from the frozen expanse of the Arctic. A report comes in that is so alarming, so perfectly timed for disaster, that it feels like a cruel joke. A routine American U-2 reconnaissance plane, on a mission to collect air samples near the North Pole, has malfunctioned. Its navigation equipment has failed, and the pilot, lost in a disorienting landscape of white ice and endless sky, has accidentally strayed deep into Soviet airspace over the Chukotka Peninsula, the very place the Soviet soldiers were told they were going. The response is immediate. The Soviet Union scrambles MiG fighter jets to intercept the intruder. In response, the US Air Force scrambles F-102 fighters from Alaska to protect their lost pilot. The American jets are armed with nuclear-tipped air-to-air missiles. For a terrifying few minutes, nuclear-armed American planes and Soviet MiGs are hurtling towards each other over Siberia. The lost U-2 pilot, realizing his catastrophic error, manages to get his bearings and escape back into international airspace just moments before they engage. When Secretary McNamara hears the news, his face goes white. You can hear the tremor in his voice as he says, "This means war with the Soviet Union." It was a simple, stupid mistake that could have single-handedly triggered Armageddon. The crisis is averted, but the incident sends a shockwave of terror through XCOM. It is a brutal reminder of how easily control can be lost, how quickly accidents and miscalculations can spiral into an unstoppable catastrophe. But the day is far from over. The worst is yet to come. Later that afternoon, another report comes in, this one from Cuba. Another U-2 spy plane, piloted by Air Force Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., is flying a reconnaissance mission over the island. He is confirming the progress at the missile sites. He is flying at 70,000 feet, a tiny speck in the deep purple sky. On the ground below, at a Soviet manned surface-to-air missile battery, a group of officers is watching his plane on their radar. They are tense, angry, and possibly confused by their orders. Historians still debate to this day whether the order to fire came directly from Moscow, or if a local Soviet commander, frustrated and on edge, made the decision on his own authority. But the result is the same. A command is given. A long white SA-2 guideline missile leaps from its launcher, a fiery exclamation point against the blue sky. It screams upwards, closing the 13-mile gap in seconds. Major Anderson would have had no warning. One moment he is flying his plane, the next his world disintegrates in a flash of light and a cloud of shrapnel. His U-2 is blown from the sky. The news hits the White House like a physical blow. The room falls into a dead, shocked silence. An American pilot has been shot down. He is the first and only combat fatality of the crisis. The hawks in the room are grimly triumphant. This is it. The Soviets have drawn first blood. The rules of engagement, agreed upon by Kennedy and his advisors, were clear. An attack on an American plane was the trigger for an immediate retaliatory airstrike on the responsible SAM site, an act that would almost certainly escalate into a full invasion. The time for talk, they argue, is over. The pressure on President Kennedy is now absolute. He is being told by his generals that he must authorize the attack. The plan is ready. The bombers are on standby. The world has never, in its entire history, been closer to nuclear war than it is in this single, terrifying moment. While the world holds its breath over a fallen pilot in the sky, you are now plunging deep beneath the waves of the Sargasso Sea, where an even more dangerous and completely unknown drama is unfolding. Leave the suffocating air of the cabinet room and enter the crushing pressure of the deep. You are inside a Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine, the B-59. This is not a sleek, nuclear-powered hunter. It is a diesel-electric boat, which means it must surface regularly to run its engines and recharge its batteries, making it vulnerable. For days, it has been hiding, hunted by the American destroyers of the quarantine line. The conditions inside are a special kind of hell. The air conditioning has failed, and the temperature in the control room has soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air is thick with the stench of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and carbon dioxide. Water is being rationed to 1 glass per man per day. The crew is exhausted, sleep-deprived, and running on pure adrenaline and fear. They have been cut off from Moscow for days, with no new orders and no real information. For all they know, the Third World War has already started on the surface. You can feel the claustrophobia, the sense of being trapped in a hot, metal tomb at the bottom of the ocean. Then, the explosions start. Muffled, concussive thuds that rattle the hull of the submarine and send shudders through the entire crew. Boom, boom. The American destroyers above have located them and are dropping small, practice-sized depth charges. This, as you remember, was the agreed-upon American signal to force a submarine to the surface. It was intended as a non-lethal knock on the door, but in the sweltering, terrified confusion of the B-59's control room, it is not interpreted as a signal. It is interpreted as an attack. The captain of the submarine, Valentin Savitsky, is at the end of his rope. He is convinced that they are under assault, that war is underway, and that his submarine is about to be destroyed. In a moment of sheer panic and fury, he screams an order. "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our navy." He orders the crew to prepare the submarine's special weapon, a torpedo tipped with a 10-kiloton nuclear warhead, a weapon with the same destructive power as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The protocol for launching this weapon was designed to prevent a single man from starting a nuclear war. It required the consent of 3 officers on board: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander. The captain has given his consent. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, gives his 2 of the 3 keys are turned. The fate of the world now rests on the shoulders of the third man, Vasily Arkhipov. He is not the captain of this boat, but he is the commander of the entire submarine flotilla, and he is on board the B-59. Arkhipov, unlike the captain, remains calm. He sees the panic and refuses to give his consent. He argues with Captain Savitsky, standing his ground in the cramped, sweltering control room. Historians and participants still debate the exact words exchanged in that heated moment, but the outcome is undisputed. Arkhipov calmly reasons that if they were truly under a lethal attack, they would not be receiving signals on the radio. He persuades the frantic captain that the depth charges are a signal, not an assault. He single-handedly calms a situation that was seconds away from starting a nuclear exchange. He convinces Savitsky to surface the submarine and await orders. In the White House, they are consumed with the U-2 crisis, completely unaware that a Soviet submarine had just surfaced in the middle of their fleet, and that the man who stepped out onto its conning tower had just saved the world. You are back in the White House. The news of Major Anderson's death has pushed the world to the precipice, and the military is demanding retaliation. The president is now facing the most important decision of his life, a decision that feels more like a trap. If he follows his general's advice and attacks, he will almost certainly trigger a nuclear war. If he does nothing, he will be seen as weak, inviting further Soviet aggression and risking a political coup from his own military leaders. The pressure is unimaginable, but in this moment of extreme crisis, a moment that is forcing everyone toward a hot, violent reaction, Kennedy makes a choice born of cold, clear logic, and a desperate kind of creativity. He decides to play the gamble of ignoring the second letter. This ingenious strategy, cooked up by his brother Robert and others, would later become known among scholars as the Trollope ploy, named after a recurring plot device in the novels of Anthony Trollope, where a female character intentionally misinterprets a marriage proposal as unconditional, forcing the suitor's hand. Kennedy decides to pretend that Khrushchev's public demand for a missile swap in Turkey never happened. He will craft a response that addresses only the terms laid out in the first, private, emotional letter. He is choosing to speak to the frightened grandfather, not the hardline premier. You are there as the response is drafted. Every word is chosen with surgical precision. The letter is a masterpiece of coercive diplomacy. It begins by expressing condolences for the downed pilot, a subtle but firm acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. It then praises Khrushchev's desire to avoid the abyss of war and his willingness to seek a peaceful solution, deliberately validating the emotional tone of the first letter. Then, it formally accepts the deal that was offered. The United States solemnly agrees not to invade Cuba and to lift the quarantine. As soon as the Soviet Union agrees to remove the offensive missile systems under the supervision of the United Nations, there is no mention of Turkey, not a single word. It is a brilliant move. It puts the burden of peace squarely back on Khrushchev's shoulders. It gives him exactly what he asked for in his first letter, allowing him to claim a victory by securing a non-invasion guarantee for his Cuban ally. To refuse this offer now would be to admit that his primary goal was not the defense of Cuba, but something far more aggressive. But this public letter is only half of the strategy. The other half must be delivered in secret. The trollop ploy is a public fiction, and a private truth is needed to make it work. President Kennedy summons his brother Robert one more time. You follow him as he drives to the Soviet embassy for another secret late-night meeting with Ambassador de Brennan. In this clandestine meeting, Robert Kennedy delivers the second, unspoken part of the deal. He tells de Brennan that while the president cannot and will not publicly trade the missiles in Turkey, he has been planning to remove them for some time anyway. He gives the ambassador his personal assurance that if the Cuban crisis is resolved peacefully, the Jupiter missiles in Turkey will be quietly removed within a few months. But, he warns, this is an absolute secret. If the Soviets ever mention this part of the deal publicly, the offer is off the table. It is the final, desperate offer. A combination of a public ultimatum and a private sweetener. A masterstroke of diplomacy that gives Khrushchev both a public victory and a secret one. The message has been sent. The world can do nothing now but wait to see which Khrushchev will answer. The final offer has been made, a delicate and dangerous blend of public ultimatum and private assurance. Now, a profound and terrible silence descends upon the world. You are with the men in the White House, and the waiting is an agony. They have played their last card. There is nothing left to do. No more strategies to debate. No more letters to write. All they can do is wait for a response from Moscow. The fate of civilization hangs on the decision of one man, thousands of miles away. The tension is no longer a sharp, electric crackle. It has become a heavy, suffocating weight. The president tries to project an image of calm, even attending a church service, but the strain is etched on every face. The hours of Sunday morning, October 28th, tick by with excruciating slowness. Each minute feels like an hour. The military remains on its highest alert, DEFCON 2, the step just below all-out nuclear war. Bombers loaded with atomic weapons are still in the air, flying continuous airborne alert patterns, ready to proceed to their targets on a moment's notice. The invasion force is still massed in Florida, their engines idling, waiting for the green light. The world is a loaded gun with a trembling finger on the trigger. The men of XCOM know that if they do not receive a positive response from Khrushchev by morning, they will have no choice but to proceed with the invasion of Cuba on Tuesday. Monday is their self-imposed final deadline. Then, at 9 o'clock in the morning, Washington time, the news arrives, and it comes, once again, from an unexpected source. It is not a secret teletype, nor a diplomatic cable. The first signal that the crisis is over comes from a public broadcast. An aide rushes into the cabinet room, waving a news bulletin. Radio Moscow is broadcasting a new message from Premier Khrushchev. The men huddle around a radio, their hearts pounding, listening to the crackling voice of the announcer as a translator relays the words. The message is a stunning, complete capitulation. Khrushchev announces that the Soviet government has given a new order to dismantle the arms which you described as offensive, and to crate and return them to the Soviet Union. He speaks of his trust in the president's non-invasion pledge and his desire to liquidate a conflict which endangers peace. The words are almost unbelievable in their clarity and finality. He accepted the deal. He chose the off-ramp. He blinked. A wave of relief, so profound, so overwhelming, washes through the room that it is almost a physical force. Men who have been at each other's throats for 2 weeks, hawks and doves, warriors and diplomats, now grin at each other, their faces slack with exhaustion and disbelief. Some accounts say there were handshakes, others that men simply sat in stunned, grateful silence. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, a man known for his stoic, almost emotionless demeanor, famously turned to McGeorge Bundy and said, "We have been eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." It was a simple, homespun phrase that perfectly captured the raw, primal nature of the standoff that had just concluded. Across the planet, as the news spreads, a world that has been holding its collective breath for 13 days finally, shakily exhales. The cities that were targeted for annihilation are still standing. The sun is shining. The crisis, for all intents and purposes, is over. The knot of war has been untied. The world celebrates. You can see the newspaper headlines, bold and triumphant, declaring Kennedy the victor in a global test of wills. He is the hero of the hour, the young, steel-nerved leader who looked into the abyss, refused to blink, and forced the Soviets into a humiliating retreat. The story that is told to the public is clean, simple, and immensely satisfying. It is a story of American strength, resolve, and righteous victory. For decades, this will be the official, accepted version of events, taught in history books and celebrated in political speeches. It is a good story, but it is not the whole story. Now, you must be let in on the secret, the hidden codicil to the agreement, the part of the deal that was so sensitive it remained classified for more than 25 years. To understand it, you must turn your attention to the rolling hills of Turkey, to a series of American military bases not far from the Soviet border. There, standing like silent, silver sentinels, are the PGM-19 Jupiter missiles. These are the American counterparts to the Soviet missiles in Cuba. They are liquid-fueled, medium-range ballistic missiles, and they can strike cities in the Western Soviet Union in under 15 minutes. They are the reason Khrushchev felt he had the right to place his own missiles in America's backyard. Here is the truly eccentric and obscure part of this story. These Jupiter missiles were, in military terms, already junk. They were a relic of a bygone era of rocketry. They were powered by a volatile liquid fuel that took hours to load, making them useless for a rapid retaliatory strike. They were positioned above ground, making them incredibly vulnerable to a preemptive attack. Kennedy himself considered them obsolete and dangerous liabilities. In fact, months before the crisis even began, he had quietly ordered the State Department to begin negotiations with Turkey for their removal, but the process had been bogged down in diplomatic inertia. Khrushchev, in his second, harder letter, was publicly demanding the removal of missiles that the American president already wanted to get rid of. This is the secret that Robert Kennedy carried to Ambassador Dobrynin on the night of Black Saturday. This was the private assurance that sweetened the public deal. You can imagine the scene, the hushed tones in the Soviet embassy as the president's brother laid out the final, unspoken offer. He promised that if Khrushchev removed the missiles from Cuba and never, ever spoke of this part of the arrangement, the Jupiter missiles in Turkey would be quietly dismantled a few months down the road. It was a diplomatic masterstroke. It allowed Kennedy to maintain his public image of unyielding strength and to hold the NATO alliance together, while privately giving Khrushchev the one thing he needed to save face with his own hardliners in the Kremlin. Historians still debate whether this secret concession was the linchpin of the entire agreement, or if Khrushchev was so terrified of war by that point that he would have folded anyway. The promise was kept. In April of 1963, 5 months after the crisis ended, the Jupiter missiles were quietly removed from Turkey, not as part of a grand disarmament treaty, but under the mundane guise of a system upgrade. They were replaced by far more modern and far more lethal Polaris submarines patrolling the Mediterranean, a move that actually strengthened NATO's position. But Khrushchev had his tangible concession. The public story was Kennedy's victory. The secret story was a pragmatic trade. And for decades, the world would only know half of the truth. The missiles are gone, crated up and shipped back across the Atlantic under the watchful eyes of American reconnaissance planes. The quarantine is lifted. The world has stepped back from the brink. Now, the political dust begins to settle, and you are there to witness the aftermath, the consequences for the two men who held the fate of the world in their hands. For one, it is a moment of supreme triumph. For the other, it is the beginning of the end. In Washington, President Kennedy's political stature soars to incredible heights. He is no longer the young, inexperienced leader who stumbled at the Bay of Pigs. He is now seen as a masterful statesman, a leader who possessed a rare combination of steely resolve and prudent restraint. He stared down the Soviet Union and won. His approval ratings skyrocket. He has proven his mettle on the world's biggest stage, and his presidency, which once seemed in jeopardy, is now imbued with an aura of historic greatness. You can almost feel the shift in the national mood, a sense of pride and renewed confidence in American leadership. He had faced the ultimate test and had not been found wanting. The ghost of the Bay of Pigs has, at long last, been exorcised. But inside the White House, the mood is not one of arrogant celebration. It is one of profound sobriety. Kennedy and his advisors are deeply shaken by how close they came to the abyss. They understand that they did not so much win as survive. A famous, and perhaps apocryphal, story circulates about Kennedy's reaction in the immediate aftermath. He supposedly remarked to his brother, "It was a hell of a gamble, but it's a bit like taking your life in your hands and rolling the dice with God." Whether he said it or not, it captures the terrifying sense of chance and luck that hung over those 13 days. He had learned a powerful lesson about the limits of power and the terrifying ease with which a crisis could spiral out of control. Now, travel back to the Kremlin, where the atmosphere is very different. For Nikita Khrushchev, the outcome is a disaster. While he may have secretly secured the removal of the Jupiter missiles and a non-invasion guarantee for Cuba, the public perception is one of utter humiliation. He is seen as the leader who recklessly pushed the world to the brink of war, only to back down in a cowardly retreat. His own military is furious. They feel he betrayed them, that he had a winning hand and folded. The hardliners in the Presidium, the men who had been watching and waiting for him to stumble, now see their opportunity. His attempts to spin the outcome as a victory for peace and a successful defense of Cuba fall on deaf ears. The political damage is irreversible. One of the more peculiar curiosities of his downfall was the role of Fidel Castro. Castro was incandescent with rage at Khrushchev's decision. He felt he had been used as a pawn in a superpower chess match, and then betrayed. His country's sovereignty bartered away without his consent. His fury further damaged Khrushchev's standing among international communist movements. The crisis had exposed Khrushchev as a reckless gambler who had lost his nerve. Historians still debate whether the Cuban Missile Crisis was the primary cause of his ouster, or merely the final nail in the coffin for a leader whose agricultural policies and de-Stalinization efforts had already made him many powerful enemies. 2 years later, in October of 1964, almost 2 years to the day after the crisis ended, Nikita Khrushchev was unceremoniously stripped of his power and forced into retirement, becoming a non-person, an unperson in the Soviet state he had once led. He had saved the world, but in doing so, he had lost his own. The world has exhaled, but it is a changed world. The shared, terrifying glimpse into the abyss has left a permanent mark on the psyche of both superpowers. The leaders who survived the crisis understand, in a visceral, unforgettable way, that the old rules of brinkmanship and confrontation are no longer sustainable in a nuclear age. The near-death experience of October 1962 becomes the catalyst for a profound, if slow, psychological shift. You are now witnessing the birth of a new era, an era not of ending the Cold War, but of learning how to manage it without blowing up the planet. The most immediate and tangible legacy of the crisis is the creation of the Moscow-Washington hotline. In the aftermath, both sides recognized that one of the most dangerous elements of the crisis was the slow, cumbersome, and unreliable nature of their communication. Messages between Kennedy and Khrushchev were being transmitted through public broadcasts, through back channels, and via teletype machines that took hours to encrypt, transmit, and translate. In a crisis where minutes mattered, this was an invitation to disaster. To fix this, in June of 1963, they signed the hotline agreement. You can picture the technicians installing the new equipment, but it is not, as it is famously and incorrectly depicted in movies, a red telephone that sits on the president's desk. The original hotline was a far less dramatic, but much more reliable, submarine telegraph cable. An eccentric detail is that it also included a secondary radio circuit for backup. The first message ever sent over the hotline by the Americans was a test. The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog's back 1,234,567,890. It was not a system for voice conversations, but a teletype for written messages, a way to ensure that words were not misheard or misinterpreted in a moment of panic. It was a simple, practical tool, but a revolutionary idea, a direct and secure link between the two sworn enemies, an admission that they needed to be able to talk to each other when it mattered most. Beyond the hardware, a deeper change is taking place. The crisis forces a new kind of thinking, which will eventually be known by the French term détente. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev, in the time they have left in power, begin to speak a different language. In a famous speech at American University in June 1963, Kennedy calls for a re-examination of American attitudes towards the Soviet Union and the Cold War. He speaks of the need for a strategy of peace, urging Americans to see the Russian people not as monolithic villains, but as human beings who share the same planet, breathe the same air, and have the same interest in avoiding mutual annihilation. It is a stunning departure from the hardline rhetoric of the past. This new spirit leads to the first major arms control agreement of the nuclear age, the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963. The treaty prohibits nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. It is a small step, but a symbolically massive one. It is an acknowledgement that the two superpowers share a collective responsibility to manage the monstrous technology they have created. Historians still debate whether this spirit of détente would have continued to flourish had Kennedy not been assassinated just a few months later. But the seeds have been planted. The Cuban Missile Crisis, in its terrifying way, has served as a global education. It has taught the world's leaders that the goal of the nuclear age cannot be victory, but survival. The red telephone, or rather, the teletype machine, is installed. A permanent reminder that the only thing more dangerous than talking to your enemy is not being able to. The black and white photographs of tense men in suits begin to fade. The crackle of the radio announcer's voice recedes, and the hum of the teletype machine falls silent. The immediate danger has passed, but the crisis itself never truly ended. It simply changed its form. It ceased to be a memory, a discrete event with a beginning and an end, and instead became an echo, a low-frequency hum that now resonates in the background of our modern world. You live in that echo. It is the invisible architecture of the age you were born into, a world fundamentally and permanently altered by those 13 days. The lessons of the crisis are not just for presidents and premiers. They are woven into the very fabric of our collective subconscious. The crisis taught us a new grammar of fear. Before October 1962, the end of the world was a theological or geological concept. After, it became a political and technological possibility, a thing that could be set in motion by a single, flawed decision. This knowledge is a heavy inheritance. There are still thousands of nuclear weapons in the world, many of them far more powerful than the bombs of the 1960s, many of them on a hair-trigger alert. This is a widely known and often ignored fact of modern life. The system of deterrence that was solidified by the crisis, the grim logic of mutually assured destruction, is still the system that governs us. We live our lives under a nuclear umbrella that is also a nuclear sword of Damocles. The most profound legacy, however, is the human one. The crisis revealed the terrifying fragility of command and control. The image of the president having a red phone on his desk is a myth, but the reality is even more sobering. The President of the United States today carries a briefcase, the so-called nuclear football, which contains the equipment to authorize a launch. And with that, he carries a small plastic card, often called the biscuit, which contains the daily authentication codes. In a moment of crisis, a leader would have to physically break this